So this is Chase's 2019 Husqvarna TE-150. He's been complaining about the bike running rich at the quarter to half throttle position when we're riding tight single track and stuff like that. So today I'm going to adjust the needle setting on the carburetor and demonstrate how to do that. Now this is not the stock carburetor. If you've got one of these bikes, you might be thinking that carburetor looks different than mine. This is a Key PWK Air Striker from JD Jetting that we put on there shortly after we bought the bike. I've got the original carburetor and I can show you the same procedure with that carburetor, but it's really not that much different. Now I've removed the seat and the tank from this bike to make it easier to see what I'm doing, and really just for the purposes of the video, it's not really necessary in most cases to remove the seat and tank. You can just rotate the carburetor so that the slide is facing outward, and typically you'll have enough room to do that without removing the tank. But it does make it easier if you're at home. If you're doing this trail side, it may not be practical to remove the tank, but if you're doing this at home in your garage, it really makes it a lot easier. It gives you more room to work if you remove the seat and the tank first. Now the first thing I'm going to do is loosen these clamps on the airbox side and on the intake side of the carburetor so the carburetor can be rotated. Now I'm going to rotate the carburetor so that I can access the screws on the top of the carburetor here. Now I've got the carburetor rotated where I can access the top. I'm going to remove the two screws on the top. Now I can remove the slide. Now to remove the slide from the cable, you've got to pull this spring up, and you got to keep it pulled up with one hand. You got to compress the spring. You can kind of see how I've got the spring compressed up here to create some slack in the cable, because all I'm going to do is push down on the cable and lift up on the slide a little bit, and that's going to disconnect the cable from the slide. If you need more slack to do this, if you find that you don't have enough slack, you can disconnect a throttle tube, or you might be able to let out some adjustment up on the throttle side to get more slack in the cable. But typically you don't need to do that. Typically you can just compress the spring with one hand and lift the slide off with the other. Make sure you don't lose this little white plastic bushing, because sometimes they'll just fall right out of that spring. You don't want to lose that, so make sure you keep up with all your parts. Now we're going to move over to the workbench and make changes to the needle position. Now the needle's held in by this little cap right here, this screw, and you need a 6mm socket to remove that. Remove the cap, and now you can push the needle up and pull the needle out. The clip on this needle is currently in the 4th position. I'm going to move it up to the 3rd position to go one step leaner on the needle. That's going to drop the needle down one step when I move that clip up to the 3rd position. So these clips can go flying, so you want to be careful when you push them off to cover them up with your hand so they don't fly. So that clip is in the 3rd position now, and I can put it all back together. So I'm going to take the slide and drop the needle back down in there, just exactly the way it came out. And then I'll put the cap back on, which holds the needle in place. It's ready to go back in the carburetor. If you have a Mikuni carburetor, the process is basically the same. It's the slide. Same 6mm cap that holds the needle in. Remove the cap, change the needle position as you need to, put it back in. Now we're going to reinstall this in reverse order than we removed it. You see a little slot in that cap. This throttle cable hooks in that slot. And this can be a little tricky, but again, if you just take your time and be patient, you'll get it. Sometimes removing or disconnecting the throttle cable from the throttle housing up on the handlebar will make this easier, but the way I do it, you put the spring back on there the way it came off, compress it. So once you get the spring compressed, you can hold it like that by gripping the cable with your thumb and your index finger, and it gives you enough slack here to go ahead and hook the end of that cable back into the slide. Now once it's hooked in, you hold some tension on it, let the spring go, and it's critically important that spring snaps down in, so there's that little plastic collar has a tab on it that has to go into the slot of that cap, and that's what keeps the throttle connected to the slide. If you don't get that snapped in there that way, you just turn the spring until it snaps in. If you don't get it snapped in that way, your throttle cable is going to come disconnected on you. So that's a critical step. Whenever you take your slide out, put it back in, you got to make sure that little plastic collar snaps down into the groove on the cap. So now we can put the slide back into the carb. I'm going to rotate the carb back into the position it should be in. Now I'm going to tighten those clamps back up to hold the carb in place. And you want to check your throttle operation to make sure it operates freely. So that's how you change the needle position on almost any two-stroke dirt bike. It's going to be a very similar process for any KTM or Husqvarna two-stroke. I showed you the key and the Mikuni carbs. It's really the exact same procedure for no matter which carb you have. So this video is intended just to show you the procedure. Your jetting and your needle position settings are going to be different for every bike, and you'll need to do some research and figure out what you need to do for your bike. So hit that thumbs up button if this video helps you in any way, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks for watching.